All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's ATD Houston webinar, Key Learning Trends in the Future of Learning. It's an ATD research presentation, and we have a presenter with us by the name of Maria Ho, who is ATD Houston, or ATD's research manager. My name is Ken Kahn, and I am the Director of Virtual Technologies here with ATD Houston. I usually play a completely background role. If you've been on any of the webinars in the past, I'm kind of the guy that takes the registration from the ATD Houston website, and I set up these go-to webinars that we use and kind of help people if they need their connection details and help people in the background with things. The person that usually does the front end, Janet Harrison, who is on the programs group for the virtual programs, she couldn't be here today, so she asked me to step in and do her introductions for her. So that's why you get to see me and you get to hear a little bit more from me than you normally would. So again, welcome, and let me tell you a little bit about Maria. Maria is, like I mentioned, the ATD research manager. She handles the ATD's portfolio of talent development industry research. She authors research reports and other research products, analyzes data, and develops research plans and quantitative models. She also promotes and presents ATD's research by blogging, posting on social media, and giving presentations. Maria is especially interested in performance measurement and evaluation and the impact of new technologies on training. So prior to joining ATD, Maria was a public policy researcher, data analyst, and writer at the Pew Charitable Trusts in Washington, D.C. So you can see Maria is going to give us some great information today. As you participate in the webinar, if you are in an area where you can open up your microphone and speak with us and share comments or questions, if you just raise your little hand tool, I'll look for that and we'll know that we can go to you so you can ask your question or share your comment with the group. If you're not in a spot to do that and or you're not comfortable doing that, you do have a little question chat area, and you can just type that in there throughout the presentation, and Maria and I will be kind of watching for that. So if it's just a comment that you want to share or a clarification that you need or a question that you have, please put it in there throughout the presentation and we will go to it. And I know Maria is planning on just some general Q&A at the end, but we want this to be as interactive as possible, so please jump in throughout the presentation today. So with that, let me turn things over to you, Maria, and we're interested in hearing what you have to share.
Great. So good afternoon, and thanks so much, Ken. It's actually an absolute pleasure to be presenting today. And we actually added some brand new data from a poll we just closed last week on where learning executives think learning is headed in the short term. So you'll actually be the first to see some of the graphs and data that we're releasing in this webcast. And as Ken mentioned, we'll try to grab questions during the webcast, but hopefully we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end about the presentation, but also if you have any questions for me about any research that ATD is doing, or if you even just have general questions about ATD National and our services. So today we'll actually discuss some of ATD's research on what learning will look like in the year 2020, which is actually only 4 years away. Thought it was a little farther away than that, and we'll talk a little bit about the learners of the future, which are 2020's learners, and what they'll demand. There's been a lot of talk in the news and pretty much everywhere you look about millennials and the future of work. So we'll touch on some of those themes. And then, well, 2020 is 4 years away, but as I mentioned, we also have some brand new research on short-term predictions for our industry. So what kind of trends do executives think will have the most impact on learning in the next year? And they'll also talk a little bit about where they think funding and some of the activities that learning is involved in are headed within the next year. So I'm going to just dive straight in and talk a little bit about our research on learning and learners in 2020, which is the first part of the presentation. So in late 2015, we fielded a poll to about 400 people in the learning industry, primarily at the manager and above level, on where they think learning is headed in the future. And we also conducted interviews with a large number of companies, including IBM and the Gates Foundation, on where their learning leaders think learning is headed. And really what we wanted to ask is not just what they thought would characterize learning in 2020, but also whether they felt their organizations were prepared for the future and what they were doing to prepare for those changes that they expect to take place by 2020. So the report is titled Learners of the Future, and you can grab some more information on it at td.org/LOTF. If you are a member of ATD National, in addition to a chapter, you can actually download a free white paper version of that report. So what do learning leaders think is going to characterize learning in the year 2020? Well, not surprising, most of them expect a little less traditional classroom learning. But it's not going away completely. 70% think it will be characterized by a blended approach, and that's generally pretty consistent with what we've seen in all of our polls. We see that blended learning is really something that's expected to increase in the next few years and is already in use in most organizations. So it's a blend of the live classroom and e-learning. 65% do think, however, that e-learning will be used to a greater extent. So while some classes right now, for example, might be taught primarily live and then there's just the e-learning reinforcement mechanism, a lot of people think that the e-learning part of that will be larger and larger as we move forward. And I do want to point out the third piece of this because it's an area that we're looking into doing some research in over the next year, and that's micro-learning. 62% think that micro-learning will increase in the next few years, and that's also not particularly surprising. But when I mention the word micro-learning, what's the first question that I always get is just what is micro? And that's a great question. We know it's small, easily consumed chunks, but what's really interesting to us is that there's so many different opinions out there on how micro is micro and what's the ideal length of time for micro learning. So that's something that we really want to dive into as a research organization some more in the next year or so. I'd be interested if you want to use the chat box or if you want to let us know what do you think of as micro-learning, because there's so many different opinions. Is it a minute? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Is it characterized by just one concept, or is it a couple of concepts? And again, there's also this whole landscape of micro-learning out there in terms of what do people think of is the right delivery mechanism. There's a lot of debate out there about whether text, for example, or video, or just an email notification is the best way to, conduct microlearning. And I did get an interesting comment. It said microlearning is 5 to 10 minutes. So that's really something that we're looking into. There's just so much debate around this topic that it's, for a researcher, it's very fascinating. And someone did also ask a question that we also are interested in looking to is, are you expecting microlearning to replace traditional learning, or is it an add-on reinforcement mechanism? And you're kind of looking to the future because that's one of the questions that we've done some review of the literature out there, and there isn't some definitive answer on that, whether it's ideal for standalone or whether it's ideal as a reinforcement mechanism. So that's something that we're actually planning on looking into in our research in the next year or so as well. Another piece of this is organizations will rely more on experiential and action learning. So experiential learning, we just released a report on this that you can find at td.org/experiential on experiential action learning, which is an area that encompasses not just on-the-job learning and simulations, it also encompasses serious games as well as adventure learning and some other areas such as that. One of the really interesting things we found in our research, was the report was titled Experiential Learning for Leaders. We want to look specifically at leadership development. And what we found was that most organizations do have some level of experiential learning for leadership, but really what characterized the high performers is that they were offering a range of experiential learning, and they weren't just offering it to their senior leaders, they were also offering it to frontline leaders and new managers, which really makes sense because, these are groups that may not have had a lot of experience dealing with leadership and managerial situations. And so having hands-on experience or practicing scenarios is extremely valuable to them. And so you can grab that report at td.org/experiential. 60% gave the vague but interesting answer of learning will take place in ways we can't imagine today. You can make it that what you will. And 53%, interestingly enough, said learning will be collaborative, involving employees' personal and professional networks inside and outside the organization, which I think is quite interesting. It speaks a lot to the rise of, social learning. And don't know if any of you are in the mailing list, but as Ken mentioned, I used to work at an organization, the Pew Charitable Trust, which does a lot of research on the kind of landscape of technology in America. And if you just do a Google for Pew Research, I believe it was either yesterday or 2 days ago, they just released a great report on how people use social media and social learning at work and different networks. And it was very interesting. It took a look at how people use their networks inside and outside the organization, as is mentioned. And also, it did take a little look at the dark side of kind of social learning, which is that, a lot of people do think that there's the downside of it being a time waster and drawing people's attention away from work that they need to do. So definitely check that out if you have a chance. I haven't had a chance to dive too deeply into it, but there's a lot of great points in there for anyone who's interested in social learning. 52% said employees will self-direct learning, and only 47%, interestingly, said learning will be delivered via mobile devices. But I will point out that our research has shown that right now, as of 2015, 2016, we're seeing about only a third of organizations have any sort of mobile learning program. And a large number of those are really quite, informal. They're not particularly structured, or they don't have a very defined kind of program or set of objectives. So, I would be very interested in any of you chatting to see what your mobile learning is, what your company's kind of evolution on that spectrum of mobile learning is. And so, now we've looked a little bit at what characterizes learning programs and delivery in the future and what people think it'll look like. But I think that's we need the context of what tomorrow's learners look like, because in order to deliver this to them, we need to understand at the root of it what their demands are. And I know we've all heard a lot about the future of work and the future, being millennials and all that. So what's really interesting is our poll we used a poll to draw a picture of what people thought the future learner looks like. And I won't go through all of these, but you can see on this page it's people want clarity, they want a lot of opportunities, and they want choice. So they want choice and variety so they get bored. And they want to have input into decisions about their own learning and control over their own learning. So in many ways this begs the question of, do we need to do more personalized sort of learning plans for individuals, which is, our research has seen that this is something that's associated with high-performing organizations. So what else do future learners look like? They want frequent feedback, access to mentors and coaches, and they like to learn from their peers, which kind of points out, what we touched upon a little bit, social learning and knowledge sharing. They feel like they don't have enough time to learn all they want, and they prefer micro-learning, as we touched on, and they want their learning to be interactive and on demand. And then finally, there's this last one. They're more comfortable with and likely to use technology compared to to current learners. So we took all this, and what sets apart that one in red at the bottom? Because and what the answer is honestly all this other stuff that we've gone through, right? Clarity, control, flexibility, feedback, prefer learning to be around their schedule. Those are really what current learners and learners of the past look like. It's not unique to learners of the future. The real difference is that bottom one. Learners of the future are unique in that they're more comfortable with and likely to use technology. So I think, in some ways, it kind of feeds into some of these things that people have always said about the future of work and millennials and all that, but at the same time, a lot of these characteristics are really just unique to learners as a whole. So how are learning functions preparing for these shifts for these learners of the future? And the truth is, we're really hard on ourselves because less than 40% of learning leaders that we polled claim their teams are really ready for learning, for learners of the future. Only 37% said that they take ongoing action to understand and prepare for changes in the way people learn. And even more interestingly, only 38%, which is almost identical, said that they'll be ready to meet the needs of the organization in 2020. And there's a large number of reasons. And so what we see is that we talked a little bit about how technology is really what's, different in the future. And so technology changes the way learners learn and how we can deliver learning to them. But it also changes the role of learning because the technology we have in terms of LMS systems, in terms of analytics, are so much more powerful. So we ask, to what extent will the following characterize the role of learning function? And what's really interesting is it will turn learning into trackers. They don't think the LMS is going to go away, but what they think is going to happen is that the LMS is going to evolve into having better tracking capabilities. So some of you may have heard about learning LRSs, which kind of track an individual through the lifetime of their learning experiences. And then 73% said that technology will turn learning into better assessors and evaluators. And that's really interesting because we just completed some research on evaluation. And one of the most interesting things we found was that people claim that the limitations of their technology and the limitations of the LMS in collecting data was one of the biggest barriers to conducting effective evaluations. But I do want to caution that if learning thinks that, we're going to turn into assessors and measurers over the next few years, our evaluation poll found that the number of learning staff that have kind of evaluation skills is relatively low, and organizations have real difficulty, even if they can collect this data, attracting staff that has the ability to conduct sort of these higher level evaluations of learning programs. One interesting point we found is that only 8% of organizations find it easy to attract staff with those skills. And in fact, the majority find it explicitly difficult. And even more interestingly, once they hire these people, learning functions can't really retain them. Only 12% said it was easy to retain staff with evaluation capabilities, and 40% said it was straight up difficult to retain these individuals. So, technology will turn L&D into assessors of effectiveness and measurers. But right now there's also a skills gap on the part of the learning profession in being able to carry out those evaluations. Technology will also cause learning to use a blend of internal and externally created content, which is not surprising. Right now we find that about a quarter of spending is actually on vendor services and kind of on externally developed products and services within a typical learning function. So most organizations are already curating and blending vendor content with internally created content. A lot of organizations are also tapping into universities and other organizations that provide continuing education. We find about an eighth of the spending for a typical learning function any given year is now going toward tuition reimbursements and continuing education. And so we find that most organizations are really blending internal and external content already in providing a learning experience. And there's also, it doesn't even touch upon the role of free content that organizations are sourcing or crowdsourced content. 60% think that it'll be easier to create individual learning plans, and 60% think it's going to be easier to deliver content that's customized to learning preferences. We talked a little bit about mobile and micro-learning. And I think what's really interesting is I'm going through some of the comments that you're sharing, and that, some of you mentioned that you think by 2020 you will incorporate mobile learning, but you don't have it so far. And, I think another person said that micro-learning and mobile, is great for job aids or reinforcement, but so far it doesn't seem to be that formalized. And that's what I did mention. Only a third of organizations have mobile learning, and a good portion of those are actually what we would consider to be informal, meaning there's no clear structure, objectives, and plan. So what can learning do about it now? And this touches with my point about tuition reimbursements and higher education as well. It's not just taking your current employees and putting them through, external programs and paying for tuition reimbursements. It's also partnering with higher ed to train graduates who are ready for 2020. And some of the best practices that we saw from firms in the research are developing internship programs in partnership with colleges and universities, and also influencing what's in higher education curriculums. And that could be anything. We do talk a lot about, for example, leaders as teachers within organizations. So that's when you have your executives teach within an organization. And that's in the research has been shown to be a best practice as far as increasing engagement among both leaders and those that they teach, and increasing the effectiveness of learning. But we don't talk a lot. One thing that we do find from this research is that it's also about potentially having your leaders have an influence on higher education curriculums and participating perhaps even as in the leaders as teachers capacity within classrooms that you're partnering with. And what's really interesting is why is this so important? It's because only 12% holds that they have not encountered some sort of skills deficit in recent college graduates. And it would be great if some of you want to use the chat box to share with us what some of the skills deficit areas that you've seen are. Are they in interpersonal skills, technical skills, teamwork skills? I will show you on the next slide what our poll said. I'm wondering if it corresponds with what you've seen in your own organization day to day, particularly if your organization does hire and train a large number of recent grads. So what's really interesting is we did do some research on millennials, and the majority of respondents, not the vast majority, sorry, 56% admitted that that generation is not equipped with the skills they need to be successful. But where they really were lacking skills is soft skills that lead to effective leadership, to effectiveness in leadership roles. And so what's really interesting is one of you just kind of said that, interpersonal skills is one area that's lacking. And that's certainly true, based on the research. And someone said, can you elaborate on the soft skills? I don't have that report off the top of my head. I believe that some of the areas that they were talking about were kind of communication skills and effective teamwork skills. And so what else can learning do? So internal collaboration is key. So collaboration within your learning department with each other, and also collaboration with other departments within the organization, particularly those that are bringing in large numbers of new hires. Also, knowing what the business strategy is for the future of the organization and positioning learning is important to delivering on that strategy. So again, we talk often about learning having a seat at the table, and I think that's a big part of this. And then maximizing things like social learning, really involving the end users in designing learning, and looking and developing collaboration abilities among leaders and employees. And what else? And what else can learning to do about their own skills? We talked a little bit about evaluation skills, but also being prepared to deal with, I think, globalization, staying on top of the technology and the skills required to leverage it for learning, ensuring that you have the talent on your own learning team to deliver on that vision. And we'll talk a little bit more, actually, in the second part of this presentation on hiring for learning and spending on learning in the future. And then also developing both specialization and a broad view within your learning team. And so now that we've discussed learning in 2020, we want to talk a little bit, and this is the second part of the presentation, on some short-term trends that we expect to see in the rest of 2016. So actually, we conducted a poll of talent development leaders recently, of 301 talent development leaders and executives, and you can actually download this report for free at td.org/tdxci. The Talent Development Executive Confidence Index. So we poll leaders in the field at the director and C levels and VP levels about where they think learning is headed in the short term. So spending on learning, how well they think their function is being regarded within the organization, whether or not they're better or worse equipped to meet the needs of learners. And so we also asked about some influencers in this poll, and one of the most interesting things we found was, to what degree do you expect the following to affect talent development in the next year? And recall that we saw that blended learning was one of the biggest influencers we expected to see. And now we're seeing that 43% think blended learning will actually have a large influence in the next year. And recall that about 70% expected to be a major influencer and to characterize learning by 2020. So not only is its use on the rise, it's already in use in many organizations. 43% think interactive distance learning is going to be a major influencer. And we're actually doing some research on this topic right now on virtual classrooms. And by that I mean kind of synchronous, virtual classrooms which allow for some level of interactivity in real time with the instructor and your quote-unquote virtual classmates. And what we're seeing is that they're in use in in the majority of organizations. I think about nearly 3/4 of organizations do have some level of use of virtual classrooms right now. And then We also do see that only 24% think mobile devices will have a large impact. Recall that about 47% thought that mobile learning would characterize learning by 2020. And so the 24% is, again, that's sort of in line with what we saw. Recall that I mentioned that only about a third have mobile learning programs, and a large number of those are actually informal. 23% see simulations and gaming having a large impact. Although it's not in this paper, one thing that in this graph, some of our other research has shown that there's somewhat of a higher use right now still of scenario-based learning, which is where someone gets a hypothetical scenario and describe to them, either written or verbally, and they explain what they would do in that situation, rather than an actual simulation, which still tends to be a little costlier, as well as gamification, which also tends to be a little costlier. So that's kind of where we are looking in the next year, which is a little bit of a shorter term. And I also want to point out 36% said informal and social learning would characterize learning during the next year, which, again, is kind of in line with what we expect to see with who has a social learning program and who uses social media for learning. It's kind of still a interesting area right now where organizations are trying to figure out how to really effectively, I think, use social media and informal opportunities to create these meaningful learning opportunities. And very few organizations are actually measuring the impact of that. But so so I think to give a little bit of context for this, we also do need to ask where learning thinks corporate performance is really headed in 2016. So you can kind of see that we're a little less optimistic than we were last year. But still, 54% think that their organization's situation in 6 months is going to be better off than today. So that's still pretty high. It's down from the 70% that we saw in 2015, but it's still a majority. And then another 33% expected to stay stable. 13% actually expect their organization's corporate situation to be worse. So what about funding for talent development? So knowing what we know about where the corporate performance is headed, we can now see, hey, if your overall funding or if your organization is going to be doing better, does that mean talent development will actually get more dollars? Or are we just going to sit, where we are, right? So what's actually really interesting is someone asked how much of the performance improvement has to do with trends in budget and economy. So we're getting into it now. Yep. So during the next 6 months, do you expect your organization's funding for talent development to change? And what's really interesting is that recall that even though about half of people, a little over half, right, thought that their organization was going to be doing better, that the bottom line for their company is going to be better, they really expected their talent development funding to stay stable. And even though only 13% expected their organization to be doing worse off, 22% expect a decrease in spending, and only 23% expect an increase in spending. And I can actually tell you that one interesting thing we saw too is that if you're interested in staffing specifically for talent development, right, only about, I think, less than 1 in 6 said they expect staffing levels for the talent development function to increase over the next 6 months. So even though a company might be doing better or a company might be expanding in terms of, employment number, only 16% expect to have more talent development staff. And what's another interesting statistic is that we see in our annual State of the Industry report that the ratio of talent development staff to employees is about 400 to 1 across all organizations. So it's for every 400 workers, you expect about 1 talent development staff. So And, the numbers of talent development staff remains pretty stable, even as an organization expands and contracts. So it can vary a lot from year to year. And some between, the 200s and the 600s. Another interesting thing that we really do see is that organizations staff their talent development function. It's very much dependent on size organization, right? Because there's some economies of scale here. So we typically, we see in our state of the industry report that for smaller organizations, there's a ratio of about 60 to 70 workers per talent development staff, and that large ones, it's about 1,000 workers per talent development staff. And by large, I mean 10,000 or more workers overall. And small, I mean less than 500. And then in that middle group, 500 to 10,000 people, it's right around that average where we see around 400 people per talent development staff member. So I wonder if any of you are expecting an increase in the size of your talent development team, or if you're really expecting an increase in funding. So that seems to be a relatively rare opinion. So what we see is that even though sometimes when companies are doing better or expanding, what we see is that talent development staffs are doing more with less, which is actually, does speak to the great work that you're doing in organizations. On one level, right? So someone actually did say both. We expect the expansion in our funding and our staff. And that's relatively, I think that's relatively unusual, actually. Another thing we do see, too, is that sometimes talent development funding, we see it sometimes follows, and we see it sometimes trails about 6 months to a year behind changes in overall employment and changes in overall economic performance. And that might be a function of how often your budgets are reviewed. So a company could be blowing up and you could be onboarding tons of new people, but you might have to wait 6 months to a year, or even in some cases 2 years, before things are reviewed and your budget is increased. And so we do see some of that we've been doing this Talent Development Executive Confidence Index since 2008, and we've been doing it every quarter. So you can see we have a lot of data points, and we've actually statistically seen that it trails unemployment and it trails GDP. It trails GDP and it trails economic performance. So the economy could improve. Economy could improve now, right? Could be improving this quarter. But you may have to wait. But typically talent development optimism and funding trails behind 1 or 2 quarters because it has to catch up with the budget. So what we typically see is the economy expands, unemployment goes down, and then talent development is onboarding new people, and then the confidence of talent development executives in their own function improves. So at this point, I'd like to ask if there's any additional questions about some of the data we've gone through and open up a little bit of a conversation about what your functions are doing to prepare for the future. And if you have any, if there's anything else you want to ask me about our research, I'd also be happy to answer that.
And then, excuse me, and remember, if you are in a spot where you can unmute your microphone and share with us and actually talk with the group, that'd be awesome. Just raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone. Or like so many of you have been doing, and we appreciate that. Lauren, Carolina, Victoria have been kind of interacting in the chat throughout. Those are some of the things that we've been throwing out there. We greatly appreciate that interactivity. Thank you.
Someone did have a question. You may have said this before, but do you do any regional research for different areas of the country? That's a great question, actually. We haven't gone too much into regions of the country. We did do some research last year on a great report called Global Trends in Talent Development, which compared from region to region across the world what people were concerned with in terms of talent. And there were some really interesting cross sort of continent or global region trends that we saw. For example, we found that priorities are very different depending on what part of the world you're in. One thing, for example, we found that building a leadership pipeline was one of the top priorities in the Asia-Pacific region, right? Because they have such rapid growth and turnover is a real issue. And there's just not enough people to ascend into these senior leadership roles there. So that was one of their top concerns versus in some other parts of the world, such as North America, one of the issues that people had, one of the top issues, knowledge transfer, because we have this issue where, we have the individuals who are aging out of the workforce and transferring their knowledge to the younger generations. Someone did have a question. Are there studies available about how many companies are growing their internal resources versus moving toward outsourcing to providers and vendors? And that is actually a great question. One thing that, although we haven't explicitly asked that question, we have tracked year on year through the state of the industry, right? What percent of people, what percent of the budget is being diverted toward outsourced and vendor activities? And I can tell you a little more about that in 1 second. Let me just pull up that data. So I mentioned that currently we are sitting at about 25% of budget, right, going toward these vendors and going toward outsourcing. What we do see is percent of expenditure for vendor services. In 2014, we were at 2014, we were sitting at about 27%. So I said a quarter, it's just about 2% over a quarter. What we did see is it's crept up a little bit, but it stayed relatively stable. It's only crept up by about 1% or so. So in 2010, it was at about 26%, 27%, so not much lower. And then in 2007, we were seeing around 25%. So it's actually stayed relatively stable on a quarter. It's crept up a small amount, but we don't know, if that's just natural movements in that number or if it's, that there hasn't been a major jump over the last 10 years or so. So those fluctuations are still within the realm of not being statistically significant or not being statistically different. In fact, every year it's held stable at around 25 to like 28% more or less. So we haven't really seen an increase in budget being directed in that area. And the same thing with tuition reimbursement. It's always hovered around that 12% mark of budget going toward tuition reimbursement for the last 10 years or so. So we do have another question. When you speak of millennials, are you talking only about the recent graduates or the group as a whole? That is actually a great question. When we ask the question to people about recent college graduates, we were talking about specifically people who have graduated from college in the last few years rather than slightly older millennials. So I do think that that's worth mentioning. And when we talk about the learners of the future, we're talking about people who are relatively young and entering the workforce between now and 2020. So thank you for clarifying that. I think there is a little bit of, I think that's always something that there's a little bit of confusion over, and it's something that I wasn't particularly clear about. We're talking about people who are, in college now or left college in about the last 5 years and entered the workforce rather than older millennials. So someone is a global report you just referenced from 2015 on the website as well. Yes, it's actually at www.td.org/global trends. And if you have a ATD national membership, you can download. There's a version available for purchase, but there's also a free white paper version that you can download if you're a member of the national. The other thing I do want to point out to all of you is that our State of the Industry, if you're a member of the national, is td.org/SOIR, short for State of Industry Report. And that's actually free for all ATD national members. The whole thing is free, including all of those charts that show year on year the outsourcing spending and that show like the ratios of how many learning professionals there are to employees. All that is free. If you're an ATD national member, you just go to td.org/SOIR. You enter your profile information for our website, and you can just download that. And if you're a Pro Plus member of ATD, you also get an additional report in addition to the State of the Industry for free. And that can be you can download actually at this time, you can download the Global Trends Report for free. And that, and you can download the whole thing. And that the TDXCI, where we were talking about the short-term predictions for executives, that's actually free to everyone, regardless of whether or not you're a member. So td.org/TDXCI. The only thing is we ask is that you just enter your information and download it through the website. That just makes sure that we know how many people are downloading it and that we can continue to offer it. So these are all just some of the resources that I hope that those that any of you, regardless of whether or not you're ATD national members, take advantage of.
Can you repeat that Global Trends URL?
Sure, it's the www.td.org and then /global trends with an S on the end.
Yeah, I thought I tried that and it's saying page not found.
You can also go to www.td.org/research, and if you go to the right-hand side, it actually lists out all of our reports by year, and it's under 2015. And you can actually find a lot of the other reports that I referenced there too. And there's another report, because someone mentioned regional trends from location to location. We did do a report on talent development industry salaries and benefits, benchmarking in the U.S. specifically. And it talks about salary bands and also what types of benefits our members who work in talent development are receiving from their organizations. And that's also under 2015. It's called What Does Talent Development Pay? So you can also check that out. And that's a U.S. specific report. And one thing is we would love to, I think, get more into regional differences and also into industry differences. For those of you who do download the State of the Industry, I do urge you to look at that report if you want information specific to your industry. One thing is that in that State of the Industry report, there's industry benchmark groups. So we actually break out all the spending data, all the learning staffing data, and all the outsourcing data by industry groups. So the industry groups that we had enough participants in to break out this year in the last report were finance and insurance. So those of you who work in banking or finance, definitely that report will give you some great industry-specific data. We had almost 50 organizations in that industry participate. Management consulting, we had 30 participants in manufacturing also. So we have some great benchmarking data for that group. So if you work in a manufacturing organization, talent development, I really urge you to download the State of the Industry report and to look at the tables in there, because there are industry tables for manufacturing specifically. Another one we have is, and I do know that, being in Houston, you likely have a lot of peers, or you work in this industry, is we actually have a whole benchmark group for oil, gas, and utilities. So we actually report all that data on content areas, spending, outsourcing, staffing, specifically for learning functions within oil, gas, and utility companies. And we also have a group for software publishers. For those of you who work in the high-tech industry, we do know that there's, some really interesting industry trends. And I urge you to check that out because, for example, we know like in oil and gas, we have a huge number of hours that are probably going to, that we know are dedicated, for example, to your regulatory safety mandatory compliance training versus that's not an issue in software publishers, but they have very high upfront costs, right, of developing new product training and sales training. So those are just some of the more interesting dynamics we see between industries. If you have questions about that, I can answer it now as well.
And just so everybody knows, if you were also looking at those pages, I believe that the ATD website is down in some areas, so you might want to check back on that later.
Yeah, it's www.td.org/research. But in the meantime, if any of you have any questions about your specific industry or about data points that can help you, particularly, we do know the importance of data in getting in really making a case for learning and, for example, making a case for increasing that spending number and that staffing number. We'll try to do what we can to help by providing you with statistics that you can use. And in the meantime, I do want to share with you this page at the end. It gives you some information how you can follow us. I urge you all to follow us on Twitter at ATD Research. We do post a lot of information there whenever we have a new report. We also have some exclusive resources that are free to anyone who follows us on Twitter. For example, we make these great infographics with some of the key data points from our research reports that you can share with others and that you can use to make a case for learning. And those infographics are free and we post them on our Twitter for anyone who follows us to download. So that's just one of the great benefits that we have. We also do post whenever we find reputable facts from other sources on the state of learning today. We post those on our Twitter. So it's a great resource to follow, and we're looking forward to sharing a lot of new exclusive material with our followers. And I do want to urge you, if you have any additional questions for me or for our research team and you think of them after the fact, you can email us. We have a customer care address that will get routed to, that gets routed to us, or you can immediately just email research@td.org if you want a faster response, and we can answer some of your questions. And I guess at this time, if we don't have any other questions,
I'm not seeing any others pop in here, so I think we might be ready to go ahead and wrap things up. Is that correct, Maria?
that sounds good to me. And I just want to, at this time, thank you all for attending. We had some great comments, questions, and interaction. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope I can present to your group sometime soon again.
Yes, and thank you for doing this for our members, Maria. We certainly appreciate that, and thank those of you that participated today and attended and also interacted with us with your questions and comments. They're always welcome and love the interactivity. And look for the recording to show up here on our ATD Houston YouTube channel probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. Everybody have a good afternoon, and hopefully we will see you again at another ATD Houston event.